Great, super. And then okay, good. Right, well, let me just start. I'm going to share some slides for this first part, and then I would, if you got questions, please reach out in the question part. But there'll be points at which we encourage everyone to jump in, so just come off mute and at those points. But we'll have about 20 minutes plus at the end for a full Q&A. So really looking forward to your participation and your sharing your stories as well, please. Great. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Get a thumbs up.
Looks good.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So incident management, rescues and incident management is tonight's talk. And we're really lucky to be joined by Jeff Allen. You've got his contact details here, and we'll have them at the end. And we'll be sharing them in the reading list, which will follow on from this. The topics, well, this is probably what you're expecting us to go through. So, rescues, the environments, the environmental factors for different types of rescues, incident management, and then, framing that as problem solving and perhaps leadership. And we will do that, but a lot of what we'll be talking about will actually be, prevention, preparation, practice, and then fun things like playgrounds and paddling with your pals. How do you turn your paddling pals into a team that you can trust? Well, to help us with that, this is Jeff Allen. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your paddling journey?
Yeah, hi there, guys. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me onto the program. I feel really honoured to be here, and great to have such great attendance. Obviously, there's a lot of passionate paddlers in Scotland. It's always great to see. So myself, my paddling history started in the Cub Scouts when I was fairly young, and proceeded through Sea Scouts into the army. And then when I left the army, I got out of paddling and got into sailing, and went sailing for a few years, and then sort of got back into paddling in the late 90s and started coaching professionally for Cornwall College down in the southwest. And then in 2003, I set up a business down in Cornwall called ISKGA in Cornwall, and I traded out of that business for probably about 20 years. And then in 2012, I set up another business called Expedition Paddler, which specializes in guiding expeditions and training professional guides. So I've been coaching for about 30 years and professionally for about 23 years now. Yeah. And then in 2012, I also set up an organization called the International Sea Kayak Guide Association, which is based around training professional sea kayak guides working in remote environments. Yeah. So that's me.
Fantastic. Great. So let me go back to here. Okay, so we'll kick off with leadership, and we'll talk a bit maybe about team. Jeff, I think you've got a really refreshing approach, to leadership as a more of a sort of team-based construct. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think leadership or poor leadership is certainly something that can create problems on the water, and it's a kind of if you're leading, you need to be leading. And I sort of often say, if you think of the example of taking a dog for a walk, are you taking the dog for a walk? Are you walking side by side together? Is it a controlled environment, or is a dog dragging you down the high street? So it's knowing whether you're actually in control, and then maintaining that control throughout the period of time that your duty of care exists. So I believe in leadership from the front. I believe in leadership by example, and that probably reflects my military background as well. And quite often when you're guiding commercially, you don't always have the luxury where paddlers come to you from a known background or known system. So within British Canoeing or within the Paddle UK system, we know that we have a freestyle paddler or a sea kayak award, and we know exactly what that consists of. So we have a fair understanding of what the capabilities are within our group at whatever level they denote. But when you're leading a commercial trip, quite often you'll find that you have a very mixed bag of paddlers in your duty of care. So over the years, my leadership has kind of altered itself to one coming from a military background where you're definitely in charge and you have a distinctive duty of care, to one where it's actually a lot more commercially viable, where you're going to be able to get repeat customers come back to you. So you can't be too strong in your leadership, but it has to be appropriate.
Great. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about, how you approach, briefings, and yeah, is it where do you do a briefing? Is it an environment like this?
Yeah, so in terms of building your team, first of all, the team members need to know what's expected of them. So, are they fully conversant with what their roles and responsibilities are within that group environment? And then you as a leader, you obviously need to know what the capabilities are within your team. And that normally comes about through an investment in training. And if you was working from a commercial orientation, maybe meeting your group beforehand and having a training weekend. Or if you're in a club environment, you can certainly create what we call standard operating practices so that everyone fully understands exactly what's required of them in a given circumstance. And I think the important aspect with team is that you do invest into your training. A lack of investment into your training creates very weak team members. They might have strong personal skills, but when things suddenly start to unwind out of control, if they don't actually understand exactly what's required of them in that instance, then they're not going to be able to perform at their best, which is what we want team members to be able to do. So
Great,
whenever we're briefing a group, what we want to try and do is have that briefing in an environment where it's free of distraction. If they're looking out of a window at traffic going past, they might be missing that vital bit of information that tells them exactly what they need to do in the event of a capsize. So it's about having that environment where you can get across all the salient points of how you want the trip or how you want the expedition to unfold.
fantastic. So I'll just talk for a little bit for context. For some briefings, in the club environment, I'd be interested to know. In fact, put it in the chat, folks. What briefing tool do you use? How do you have a mnemonic that you use? So some of you might be familiar with this one. So the ABCDE approach. Does anyone use anything different? Neil, you're on mute. I think you were going to say something. No. So Jeff uses a different grade. So there we go. Craig Dibb, newly qualified ISKL up in Orkney. Congratulations, Craig. So
Congratulations.
he's using Sheet. So that's brilliant. So there's a few people using Sheets. So Sheets, this is Jeff's one. Jeff, do you want to maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so for me, I hold an initial introduction where I get the group to tell me about what their medical conditions are, their injuries, allergies, all of that kind of information. And I'll probably, when you think about your communication or gathering of information, that's going to take place before you even meet the group. You're going to send out physical activity readiness questionnaires. You're going to find out all of that background information. But then when you actually meet the group, what I tend to do is I sandwich my briefing between safety and signals at the front and back end. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is what I expect the group to be able to do in a given situation. And there's some fairly, they're quite consistent. So, for instance, we'll talk later on about casualty and victim. In a safety orientation where if someone capsizes, I would always expect them to be proactive if they could be. They wouldn't sit there like a lame duck expecting to be rescued. I'd expect to see some kind of action. And then I'm going to tell them exactly what signals I require from them and what they're going to see from me in my leadership role. And that'll be paddle signals, it'll be hand signals, it'll be voice commands, and possibly whistle signals as well. And at that stage, I'll normally put control on VHF radios because nowadays, everyone goes out to sea armed with a VHF, and that's a good thing. But there should only be one voice going outside of that group dynamic, and that should be the group leader, unless he's actually designating someone to send a message on his behalf. What you don't want is a lot of background noise going on within the group, and you don't want a group that's so large that you have to use a VHF to control that group environment. If your group can't hear you or can't see you, you're not in control. So it's really important. I know that some clubs will operate on a very large group number, and they'll need a VHF to actually be able to control part of that group. And from my perspective, that's a bit foolhardy. Yeah, from my perspective. And then I'm going to look at the
Great.
human factors, and I'm going to ask people to introduce themselves, and I'm going to find out about their medical conditions, their injuries, their allergies, anything that's going to affect their paddling performance, what they want to get out of the experience, and what they feel they need to achieve from the experience. So that's the sort of needs and desires. And I'm going to ensure that they've the right ability to be able to take on the event of the day. Um, Matching your group to the environment is a really essential factor when it comes to leadership. You need to make sure that you're matching your group well to the environmental features that are going to be playing out throughout the day. Equipment factors, I want to make sure that we've got all the group equipment that we need. People have got their personal equipment. Tow line is a personal piece of equipment. Everyone should carry a tow line with them on the water, especially if they're competent members of a group. They're going to be your towers in any kind of recovery situation. Going to look at environmental factors. So I'll be talking about the weather, the sea state, the swell reports, and looking at all the environmental factors that are going to pertain throughout that period of time that you're going to be on the water. And then we're going to look at time. From a time orientation, if you're on a day trip, it might be the time that you're going to be meeting the group, the time that you expect to launch, and the time that you get off the water. Or if you're on a longer trip, you might want to go through the daily routine. What time are you expecting people to be packed away and ready to launch by? And how long is the paddling day going to be running on for? So any time constraints. I've had people before where I've taken them afloat, and halfway through the day, they've turned around at the last minute and said, "Oh, I've got to shoot off. I've got a dental appointment at 2 o'clock." And obviously, they've then got to step out of your duty of care, and you're left in a bit of a dilemma. So I always try and understand exactly what their time constraints are, as well as the time constraints that I'm putting onto the group experience. And then we're back into safety and signals again. So I introduced the safety and signals at the front end of a briefing, and then I confirm that people have understood exactly what those safety and signal requirements are at the back end by running that as a question and answer. So that's
Fantastic.
how I run a briefing through the sheets process.
Brilliant. And I would say, I found this to be transformative as an approach, because it's not just a briefing; it's a checklist for on the water, and I've found it actually offers. I use it in coaching. So I think it's quite profound. So Jeff's just done a quick jog through that, but I would encourage you all to contemplate it, and if you ever get the chance to kind of chat deeper with Jeff about it, I would encourage you to do so. We've got an alternative here from Max Ray. Plan, group safety equipment, great, risk management, brilliant. So good to see alternatives coming in, because you've got to find the one that's right for you. So, if you've got other suggestions, folks, put them in the chat. I think if you look at signals, you mentioned, do you want to tell us a little bit about your approach to signals? You've said, you want them to be visual.
So from kind of the orientation in which I operate, we're training all the guides to operate under the same signals, and I think that's something that would be great if all national governing bodies could get together and come up with a plan for what paddle signals should be and what hand signals should be. And this is because if you have a guide that's working in Alaska and he suddenly gets a job in Norway, he might respond differently under stress to a paddle signal that, is telling him to stop, and actually it means come to me, So having signals that are universal and also non-ambiguous. In the military, putting your hand on your head like this means come to me, but in co-steering it means I'm okay, and this means ascend, and this means okay in the dive world. So, sometimes signals can be a bit ambiguous. So you've certainly got to iron out exactly what those signals are at the front end. And you've also got to be aware of the environment in which you're operating in. If you're really stretching your group's abilities out, they may not be focusing on you. They might be focusing elsewhere. So do they actually see the signal? So signals need to be repeated throughout the group. And ideally, when you've issued a signal, you want to get a thumbs up or a replication of that signal from your group members. And obviously, this signal here is come to me. Come to me is an interesting one because it kind of denotes you're telling your group member to come to you now. And the important thing is that the differentiation in that is that what it actually means from my perspective is I'm now ready to receive you. And that's slightly different because what it means is the ownership is on the person that's about to make the maneuver. And what they've got to do is they've got to check that it's safe for them to come. So if you was actually doing this signal in a rock garden and you tell them to come to you and they just paddle blindly into a feature and get caught out in a swell line coming through, then they might turn around and say, well, you told me to come to you. And so you need to really understand exactly what the information is that's being relayed. So when we say come to me, it's come to me when it's safe to do so. And we could break all
Fantastic.
those signals down into greater detail.
One of the things I really liked about your signals, Jeff, your system, is that it builds out from the RNLI Beach Lifeguard signal system, which does have international recognition, and it uses paddles. So we'll share a link to that guide in the reading list for everyone. And just to answer John, sorry, it's Bruce's question. We won't be sharing the slides, but this is recorded and the video link will be sent to you as well. And we will refer to any written or any kind of materials so you can access them yourself. So really effective in surf. That nice tall paddle. Let's go into. Want to tell us a little bit about some of the kind of mnemonics that you're using. Clap as a universal one.
I think what this is really good for is you've got to have a process that you're working to, and CLAP is the process of leadership and leadership before things go wrong. And if we follow CLAP, ideally, we won't get into any trouble because you're going to ensure that your communication is before you meet the group. So they're going to arrive at the destination that they're going to launch from fully prepared. And then you're going to give them a briefing. So that's during the time that you're with the group. And then on the water, you're going to have your communication. And I think the important thing to realize is that whenever you go afloat, things become diluted. So people don't hear as well, they don't see as well. There's an awful lot of information overload going on. Even though you don't necessarily realize it, you've got balance muscles, they're going into fast twitch. You've got environmental factors like wave action, wind, movement in the boat. So that's all actually taken away. So your communication has to be really short and simple. I think the mnemonic KISS is quite appropriate here. But once you get onto the water, keep it short and simple. And it doesn't want to be ambiguous, as we say. So you've got your communication before, during, and after. And the after would be the review, making sure that at the end of the day you do a thorough debrief, questions from, questions to, and people go away understanding, especially if it has primarily this program is about incident management. If you have had an incident on the water, then you really want to be able to go through that incident with your group before they depart, so they have a full and clear understanding of exactly what occurred and what's going to be required from them next. So communication is really key to control on the water. Maintaining line of sight, I always say if you can't see your group member, then they can't see you. And it's really important that you have that line of sight. They can see you and you can see them all the time. And if they can't, then do you have a link man? Do you have someone else that can step into a position or paddle into a position, should I say, to a point where you can see them and communication can be relayed through that person? Line of sight is a shared responsibility. So it's about them maintaining line of sight, your group maintaining line of sight with you, as much as it is you being able to see the group. Now, I'm a strong believer that we lead from the front. So because that's the place where when we're leading, we need to be able to do the risk assessment. It's also the only place where you can effectively stop a group before they hit a feature or go around a headland or go into the tide. Okay, so the only effective place that you can really stop the group, just by turning your boat sideways, your kayak sideways, you can physically prevent them from moving forwards. That means that if you're facing forward, you can't see the group. So you have to have someone at the back of a group that can see the group all the time. And that's what we call the tail end Charlie, or your number two, your assistant. So what I'll do is I'll paddle forwards 10, 15 strokes. I'll look over my shoulder and I'll look to my number two. And my number two will be briefed beforehand to give me a thumbs up, just to say that all the group are looking okay. Whether that's a trained number two or whether it's a delegated number two, you need to ensure that they're given a briefing so that they fully understand exactly what their roles and responsibilities are. So the tail end Charlie, he may not have any responsibility within that group dynamic in terms of outcome, but he has a task, and that task is to just maintain that line of sight from the back of a group. With regards to avoidance, I'll say, well, if you can't go through a feature, can you go around the feature? If you can't get around the feature, your options are to stop and wait for the feature to change until the environment becomes suitable for you to go through, or you have to go back. Now, in the sea kayak leader role, if you have to go back, that going back has to be within a certain distance or time of a safe landing. So that kind of brings in the Paddle UK remits of the award. So avoidance, what you're looking at is that kind of probability and outcome. If I go through this feature, what is likely to happen and what is the outcome if it does happen? And obviously we'll talk about probabilities and outcomes as this program progresses. Do we always avoid swims? Well, no, we don't. So sometimes we don't exercise avoidance if the outcome isn't going to be too damaging to the person's ego or physicality. So we don't always exercise avoidance because the only way we can actually extend people's comfort zones is by stretching them in their ability, stretching them in their comfort. And that's how we start to get better. So we don't always exercise avoidance, but we always have to exercise avoidance if the outcome is going to be too damaging. Yeah. And then position is position of maximum effectiveness and position of maximum safety. So ensuring that your position is always going to be effective, but your group's position is always going to be in a position of safety, and that your number two is going to understand exactly what their progress to the front of the group, if we're going to enter into a gating orientation in terms of feature management, or whether we're going to be going into something like a surf landing, etc. So clap is the mnemonic that we lead by up until things start to go wrong and we end up entering into an incident management kind of role.
Great. So you've kind of these. Do you want? I mean, rather than kind of dive into it in depth. These are kind of some of the things I understand you use: gating and shepherding and chain linking, and they're all effectively ways for us to use clap in action. So I think we'll just leave that as a taster. So if you want to know more about that, you'll have to go on a course with Jeff. Other tactics, well, I suppose maybe just look at it as a question. How would you manage this feature? You've got this, right? This here is your playground. How would you manage it? And maybe if you just take a second to think about it, folks, do you feel you have a strategy in place to approach that?
I think an
Okay, we'll
important
come
aspect
back.
there, I was, I
Sorry,
was
you go,
going to
Jeff.
say, an important aspect there is in terms of having a strategy, the leader will have a strategy, but also group members need to also have their own strategies. And I'll often say, we have a few golden rules when it comes to personal risk management, personal safety. And one of those for me is never paddle into a feature that you're not comfortable swimming back out of. And quite often we'll follow leaders into features unsure of what our skills are. And from a leadership perspective, you should never put a group into a feature that you're not happy getting them back out of. And it's quite often that then begs the question, well, do I have a rescue strategy in place before I put the group into that feature? And that's a real key aspect of avoidance, prevention, but also the realization that sometimes Neptune might just throw you a swerve ball. A big set might come through, and that big set might not be Neptune orientated. It could be a fishing boat or a ferry going past. That just changes the nature of that environment. And where you were quite happy putting the group through there, suddenly this big swell has changed the nature, and now you've got two swimmers in there. So you've got a group member's responsibility that they need to paddle within their abilities, and their abilities are always going to be dictated by the fact is that at some stage they may well take a swim. Are they going to be able to continue to act in a way that is going to be beneficial to their own safety? And that's really key. Swimming goes hand in hand with sea kayaking. And if you don't invest any time into your swimming, your swim training, and that's with equipment on as well, then, eventually you're going to end up a victim and you're going to have to be rescued. And that's what we want to try and avoid. We always want to try and train that proactive casualty mentality. Yes, we sometimes get into trouble, but we need to be responsible for getting ourselves out of trouble. And that's a kind of a mindset as much as it is a physical training orientation. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think it's useful, perhaps at this point, to just look at the British Canoeing, the Paddle UK BCAB leadership model. And this is a very well thought through model. It's got, and but the part that I always find myself going to is the vision, support, and challenge. And that's challenge is that recognition that challenge is part of what we're all doing. We're all seeking to manage challenge on the water. I'm just going to play a wee video clip for my experience of how of with Jeff exploring using challenge with club paddlers on the east coast of Scotland at Dunbar. So, stretching your comfort zone. Do you want to tell us about how we, take us through that, how that's managed safely?
From a coach's orientation, you've at the end of the day, you've always got to be prepared to pick up the pieces. You've got to be capable of picking up the pieces. So, in terms of your leadership or your coaching ability, you always need to be comfortable. And as soon as you're no longer comfortable in the environment that you're operating, and that might be the environment that's being set up by the group as well as by the environment, you need to be able to re-find it again because you're not in control if you're not comfortable. Whether that's because your own physical status, you might be feeling a bit ill, and sometimes that takes a bit of humility. So sometimes you have to actually turn around and say, well, no, today I'm not capable as a leader to lead in these conditions. So you have to understand that your abilities as a leader fluctuate, they rise and fall. So if you're not comfortable, you shouldn't be there. But your group, for you as a coach or leader to extend your group's abilities, you've got to be able to take them out of their comfort zone and start to stretch them a little bit. And that could be emotional stretching and it could be physically stretching their abilities. So how do you do this? Well, first of all, you need to know what the probabilities and outcomes are. So you have to understand exactly what your group's abilities are before you go on the water, and you'll do this in your briefing. But you also have to have a few flags and markers where you can actually underpin the group's abilities before you get out into those conditions. So that might be by running a few safe features just to see what their sense of timing is. It might be see how they space themselves in the group dynamic. You're looking for cues to see if they're aware of what's going on within the environmental aspect. And you also need to be able to implement safe practice very quickly. So if it does start to unwind out of control, you can very quickly step in and take over the situation. So we use a mnemonic called STOP, stop, think, observe, perform. Stop, if it's performed correctly by the group members, then they can make themselves safe very quickly. So at the front end of any incident, we'll always shout stop. Okay, and what they should do is turn and face outwards so that they've got control over their kayak. So you have to have in place all of that safety structure before you start to create the stretch zone, as I call it. And then once you get into that stretch zone, and you start to put people through challenges that are going to potentially have, in terms of rescue, a potentially negative outcome. So if you think about if you're doing a gully rescue, you're going to be putting people down into a gully. What you don't want to be doing is putting them straight into a five-star gully. You want to be building it up gradually, so there might be a totally flat gully to begin with so that they can get the process right of turning their kayak around in the mouth, backing in on the end of the line, grabbing the casualty victim, pulling them out again. And then you can up the ante a little bit by increasing the environmental factor. So it might be a slightly bigger wave action, it might be a bit more wind. So it's about progressive learning into that stretch zone. It's not about trying to get to the top of a ladder straight away. And then the terror zone. Is there any reason to ever go into the terror zone? Well, that's perceptive. It might be um, terror because you've never been there before, but it might be a safe environment still. You just haven't been there before. You haven't experienced it before. What can be achieved by putting people into the terror zone? Well, it can certainly expand their comfort zone a lot quicker, but you can also lose students that way. So you've got to understand what the emotional status is within your group. There's no point putting groups into the terror zone if you're going to lose them and they're never going to want to paddle with you again. Sometimes Neptune has a way of throwing us into the terror zone, um, but it's not a place that we normally go to as coaches. Um, I've certainly been put into the terror zone myself, and I know that as soon as you end up in the terror zone, you start to operate under what we call adrenal fix. So you might go into fight or flight mode, you might freeze. Um, the only area where I think that training in the terror zone does have a benefit is it really allows you to um, experience that big surge of adrenaline and then control it. And that's an important aspect that we need to be able to do as leaders, but also as group members. We don't want to be operating under adrenaline. Adrenaline has it's a big surge of energy, but we also have to pay for that afterwards with a big loss of energy. So we need to understand that the terror zone is a place that we can only go to with selected participants who are of a particularly robust nature, and it still has to be safe. So the orientation, so quite often when you think about cliff jumping, if someone's scared of heights, it might be very deep water, and if they've got correct technique, they'll enter into the water safely and they can swim away safely, but they're still going into the terror zone. So we can take people into areas where they are going to encounter fear, and through encountering that fear, they can control it as well. But we have to be able to operate in the stretch zone with our clients. And when you think about that orientation of the group members, um, as a group leader, you can only rescue one person at a time. And if you've extended your group too deep into the stretch zone, you've lost all the tools in your toolbox. You've got no one that's going to be able to assist you in the outcome of an incident management situation. So you've got to I think there's a lot of area of discussion there, and it's only through trial and error that you start to build on what is considered to be a safe coach practice in that orientation.
Great. So we've got here, this is you, and one of your teams, taking a spill, and I would imagine, I look at this and I'm feeling close to the terror zone just looking at it, So it's just as I'm sure many do, but it's about. Can you maybe talk us through how you then approach that and make it safe?
Yeah, so but we've got three members on the outside, and then there's Chris behind me, and I'm in the yellow and brown boat, and then we've got Dave who's in the mouth of a gully, and he's come in, he's mistimed a set, and that set has surfed him sideways, pushed him up against a rock. He's washed down the rock. He's tried to roll, very aerated water. His roll didn't work, and he came out on the safe side of his kayak. So, first of all, I risk assessed it, and I determined that with the group's abilities, they had the capacity, they understood about edge control. So they knew that we needed to lean on the water, let the boat take the hit if it was to go up against the rock. We put in place protective equipment, so they was all wearing helmets, so it was all in appropriate equipment to go into the water and also for impact. And we'd invested time into their training. They knew that if they came out of their kayak, they would have to go into offensive, defensive swimming, and to act in a way that would make their situation safer, personally safer. So I went into the gully, I risk assessed it, I determined that it was suitable, it was going to be a stretch, but it was going to be suitable. And then as soon as I got into the gully, I put the paddle up, called the first person in. And as Chris came in, I said to Chris, get your tow line out and clip onto the back of my kayak. So you can see off the back there, I've got a tow line attached to the back of my kayak, and you can see the line leading into Chris's boat. So what I've done is I've set my rescue up before I've asked the next person to come into the galley, fully anticipating that the next person might take a swim. I don't want to be doing this when the person has taken that swim. I want to have it all in place. So I've got the extraction sorted before I expose someone to danger. Dave's come in, he's mistimed it, he's gone up against a rock, he's capsized, he's taken a swim. He knows that he needs to come out of the boat on the safe side. So he's come out of the boat into deep water. He's turned his boat over, and I've gone into a rescue protocol that we call preach, throw, reach, go. So as soon as he's come out of the boat, I've shouted to him, Davey, you're okay. He's given me a thumbs up. He's also reacted to my shout. He's looked at me, his face turned, and he looked directly towards me. So that tells me that he's not taken a hit. His cognitive ability is there. And as soon as I've said, turn your boat over and swim towards me, that's what he did. He turned around and he swam towards me. I paddled forward and I just coached him into the gully, and he pretty much got himself out of trouble. And then once he was in the gully, I said, Dave, can you get yourself back into your kayak? And he said, yeah, no bother, Jeff. And he emptied his kayak and he did a cowboy rescue and got back in. So it certainly stretched his comfort zone, but that's a very deep water gully. I've been there. I've trained in this gully for 20 years. I've swam it at low water. I've swam it in high water, and it look visually it's quite intimidating, but it's a very safe feature to actually operate in.
Fantastic. And the great thing, so you've talked us through there, how adrenal effects, how you manage that, how you've deployed stop. Safer is another mnemonic. I'll just, if I just maybe just give a wee bit of context here. I think the thing that's one of the things I found really interesting is, someone who operates perhaps more in the club environment, then how do you then train with these, and this is an example of us taking these approaches with Jeff, again at Dunbar, and finding features and using stop as a, and then using safer. And that's actually me going in and deliberately created a casualty situation in the back of this little archway. So you can train, you can train progressively, like Jeff has explained. Safer. Do you want to give us a little bit of an overview of the safer?
Yeah, so if we lead through clap, then by rights, unless we're throwing a swerve ball, we shouldn't have any incidents. If we communicate effectively, maintain line of sight, exercise avoidance, and maintain position of safety and effectiveness, nothing should go wrong. But it does, and it does because of human error. It does because Neptune gets involved. We have equipment failure, unknown medical conditions arise. We end up in these situations. And what we don't want to be doing is making up the next move. We want to follow a trained process that has been established over time. And safer is that process. So this is what we call safer paddling. And it's the reaction that we have when something's gone wrong. And the initial stop is shouted out and then it's reinforced. So actions on stop are that we turn our kayaks and we face into the dynamic that is affecting us the most, whether it's wind, wave, tide, swell. We want to have control over our bow or stern so that we can face directly into those environmental factors that are going to potentially push us sideways or force us into that danger zone. Once we've got control over our own kayak, then we want to look into the casualty or victim. And if we explain casualty and victim, a casualty is someone who's obviously gone through their stretch zone and they've come out of their boat, but they could still be proactive. And they could be turning their boat over and they could be swimming out of the feature. So they've got into trouble, but they're getting themselves back out of trouble. And if they can't get themselves out of trouble, they're still contributing towards their own safety. So we call that person a casualty. A victim is someone who is injured, incapacitated, incapable of being able to look after themselves, and they're going to need hands-on assistance. So we always rescue casualties and victims quite differently. So when we're in the assessment phase, what we're looking for is whether they're a casualty or a victim. And in that assessment phase, if we see that they are a casualty, we can trigger concurrent activity. So we can shout into them, turn your boat over, swim out, and they can start performing. But if we see a victim, the really important aspect is that we understand whether that victim is in a state of big sick or little sick. Big sick would be unconscious. Big sick would be major trauma. And if we think about our first aid training, because first aid training very much goes hand in hand with incident management, there would have been a mechanism before that incident actually arose. That mechanism might have been a very large volume of swell. And what you heard was a crunch of fiberglass. And then you look in and you don't see any action being performed by the person that was involved in the incident. That person is a victim. And if they're unconscious or severely injured, triggering the emergency services at that stage is really crucial because it might take us 10, 15 minutes before we manage to perform an effective rescue. And if we haven't triggered the emergency services in the assessment phase, then we've wasted 12, 15 minutes of flying time or boat time when they could have been progressing towards your location. And the formulation stage is getting the person out of that feature. And that's normally it's what we term as the extraction and the rescue. So we need to determine what's going to be the safest and most effective way of getting that person out of trouble. And what I always say is when we go in to rescue casualties, we can use a preach, throw, and reach orientation. But if we have to go in and physically get hands on, we always want to go in bearing in mind that how are we going to get out again? Because if we need to go in and get hands on with a casualty or the victim, how are we going to then maneuver after that? So I'll often say that if we're going to have to go into a victim, we need to get someone to clip on to our kayak before we go in. Yeah, so that someone else can extract you. And what you don't want to do is have too many people on the work face. You don't want to be putting too many people into a feature at the same time. So getting that extraction, getting that tow set up before you actually enter into the feature is really crucial.
Fantastic. I think it's really interesting that, Safer is quite, you can see here, it's quite similar to the likes of STAR. That's what our NLI lifeguards use. It's just the same kind of strategic taking a approach. So another one from the lifeboats here, it's kind of and it reminded me of your zones of stretch, so it's just about conscious challenge and challenge by choice. Where do you want to place yourself here? Where's the benefit and risk point that matches what you want to achieve with your paddling and your group development, your team development? Rescue protocols, you've gone through this here already, so we'll just keep going. Again, one from the RNLIs, I love researching for this webinar tonight. I saw this here, which I really liked, which was a kind of risk matrix against reach, all the way through to, how hands-on, how close do you want to get, and do you recognise the risk? So there's something that's really nice about that. I'll maybe move at pace through some of the next slides, if that's okay, Jeff, because I think I've overloaded. I just get too excited about having you here tonight. So my apologies that I've overloaded these slides. But I think rather than kind of cut out and me move them about, I'm just going to move through them at pace. And if it's okay with you, I'll just, if there's ones that I think it would be really great to get your input on, we'll do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. You've mentioned earlier about proactive rescues. So there's a big list, these are all the proactive rescues, but let's just look at one in particular here. What's going on here, Jeff?
This is what we call cold water big fish rescue. So you've got a paddler that's got up onto the back deck of the rescuer's kayak while the rescuer is emptying the kayak. Cold water, if you're paddling in the wintertime in the Arctic, I quite often, or I haven't run one for a couple of years now, but I used to run whale watching trips up to northern Scandinavia in the winter months where, the water is very close to zero. In fact, sometimes it is at zero. It doesn't freeze because it's salt water. But the air temperature is also -10, -15. And if you take a swim in those environments, you go downhill really quickly. So staying in the water, hanging onto your bow, isn't the right thing to do. You've got to get yourself out of the water as quickly as you can. So a cold water orientation would be that if you capsize, if you haven't got a re-entry and roll and you may not be able to get back into your kayak, at least get the core element of your body out of the water. So drape yourself across the back of your own kayak. And then when the rescuer gets in alongside, you would get onto his or her back deck to keep your core out of the water, and the rescue would take place from that orientation. Big fish, it's not really big fish. It's just to represent that there might be danger in the water. So it could be that it's shallow, breaking water. It could be that there's fishing nets around. It could be that there's aggressive seals or marine life. So staying in the water once again isn't wise. So you would get yourself out of the water as quickly as you could.
Superb. And the thing, back deck rescues, fantastic. I hadn't practiced them before. I started training with Jeff, and it's so helpful in the surf. An amazing training technique, as I'm sure a number of the folks on the call will attest to. It really it's a quick way to test your braces and your rolls quite often. um, so this here is this is the team in November. Several members from the call. You can see Hamish here from Shetland. So you've got Craig and Duncan. So we've got James in the water here. What does everyone think happened next? Anyone got an idea, a suggestion? What was the next thing that happened? So would you have guessed this? So this what's happened is the swimmer has pulled in the rescuer, and now the rescuer's got to self-rescue and then go back to the start. So it's wonderful. I find it amazing to just be practicing these kind of things with a group and in a structured approach. Inactive
Going back
rescues.
to that photograph there, Russell,
Yeah,
if you go back to that photograph, sometimes people say, that's very unrealistic. Why is someone going to capsize you? If they're panicking, they might. If it's rough water, you might inadvertently capsize. What you're training is a process. So in terms of stop, did you follow that process? Did you think and identify before you actually approached a casualty? And also, it applies pressure to the person that's doing the rescue. If they're very comfortable at performing the rescues, well, why not capsize someone and then see if they can roll and then perform a rescue? So it's always about creating that textured and varied practice, I call it. Yeah, changing the texture sometimes.
fantastic. I'll just move through these at pace. So that's like a panic paddler rescue we discovered there. Tow rescues. But there's a million tow rescues, isn't there? But your approach is a bit different. Do you want to just give us one example? Perhaps mention the carabiners approach.
Yeah. So when we're doing a rafted tow and we're actually towing an incapacitated paddler, I will create a raft as opposed to having two kayaks being drawn through the water side by side. So a raft depends on form stability. So it has to be wider than its length to beam ratio is so that you get that stability, and it needs to be able to stay together as a raft. So I will use carabiners and I will clip the deck lines together so that the paddler cannot capsize externally or invert inwardly. I know that a lot of paddlers are always very conscious about being able to escape the raft. Well, that's what we carry a rope cutter for, a knife. If we needed to, we could cut through the deck line and escape from that very quickly. But in my experience, and I've trained rescues an awful lot over the last 25, 30 years. In my experience, in rough water, if you don't connect a raft and really stabilize a raft, quite often they will capsize inwards, especially if a casualty or the victim is actually playing that role as an unconscious person, as someone who's incapacitated, effectively. If they play that role properly, it's very easy for that raft to capsize. So I make it as stable as possible. And for me, the most effective way of pulling a raft through the water in dynamic conditions is with the inline tow. And if you put the two right people at the front of that tow, it will keep that raft going at normal group speed. two strong paddlers can tow a raft at 3 knots. Putting a third person at the front wouldn't make it go any faster. So it's about having the right people. You'll talk about husky towing, having parallel tows or V tows, two people up front pulling on a V attachment. What I found in rough water, the chances of rope entanglement are significant. So I will, generally speaking, only use an inline rafted tow. And there's not been many scenarios that I haven't been able to make that tow sequence fit. Sometimes is it better to have 100 tools to fit one job, or is it better to have one tool that fits 100 jobs? So I sort of think if we can actually find those techniques that work in 1,000 different scenarios, it's far better than having a lot of variation in terms of what we can choose from, in terms of looking at the techniques that are available to us.
Fantastic. Um, Difficult landings. We've talked about, how, caves and gullies a littttle bit already, so I think we just kind of keep going here. But I think the key thing is that it's, yeah, it's something that we can all train for. And it's to take it back to the point that Jeff had mentioned earlier on about progressions. It's about building up a progression. So here is again at Dunbar, and this is it. This is a non-consequential environment at the moment, but it's allowing those ideas to become familiar. And then here is also at Dunbar, just around the corner, on another day when there's a bit of swell running. So we start to build increase, start to go into that stretch zone a little bit. So we're getting into this idea of classrooms, outdoor classrooms, and playgrounds, and building your familiarity with that. Towing equipment, I think we could, kayakers and equipment. It's a rabbit hole we can all go down, isn't it? But I think again one of the key points of difference is you're a big advocate of sea kayakers using throw bags. And obviously that's something that river paddlers do, but it's surprisingly unfamiliar to a lot of sea kayakers. Do you want to just give us just a quick kind of input on overview on that?
Yeah, I used to do a lot of rock hopping, and if you've got a paddler that gets washed over a feature to an alternative location, and you've got to approach them by doing a difficult landing, and it's from an elevated position, sometimes you can't always reach them. Whereas if you think about this, that throw bag, that's now a 15-meter arm. You're just reaching in, it's just extending your reach to be able to get to the casualty. But we use that for so many other reasons. We use a photo, as it's called, to do difficult landings. We use it as a drogue when we're landing casualties in through the surf. So you can set that photo up into a drogue orientation. It's got about 15 different uses. You can use it as a stirrup for getting someone that's injured back into their kayak. So there's lots of different uses for it. It's an international rescue protocol as well, having that capacity to be able to throw in to a feature. I use it in surf as well. I've recovered people in heavy dumping surf with strong undertow where they've got out, they've struggled to get out of the water, and I've also rescued people in rips using a throw tow. So it's a multifunctional piece of equipment, and once you're familiar with its uses, it's very effective.
Fantastic. Other bits of kit. I think again we'll drive into the points of difference if that's okay. Thermal wrap was something I hadn't come across until I started training with yourself, Jeff. Do you want to just tell us a bit about this burrito wrap?
Yeah,
What's going on here?
having the capacity, if you have a casualty, you've got a wilderness triad. What you've got to do is you've got to be able to keep them warm, but you've got to prevent further heat loss from the casualty. So a thermal wrap is the way that we treat that situation in the outdoors. And once again, this goes hand in hand with managing an incident. Quite often we focus in great detail on the water side of things, And then we get into the beach. Well, if you've got a 45-minute wait for the ambulance to turn up, they're probably going to, if they've had a severe trauma, they're probably going to die of hypothermia on the beach. So having the capacity to keep them well insulated from the ground and to stop that heat radiating out of their body, this is a solution that we utilize. And
Great.
then that goes hand in hand with using exactly that, the group shelter. And sometimes, we think about using this group shelter for a tea break on a wet and windy day, and we might think, well, we only paddle in a group of four, so I'll buy a four-man group shelter. If you consider a first aid scenario where you've got a casualty lying down on the beach and you're lying down at the head end, controlling the head position, well, that's now a 12-foot length that needs to be protected. And then you've got other people sitting beside that casualty doing a secondary survey, checking the casualty for further injuries. That's actually quite a large surface area. So what groups should have is a minimum of a 10 to 12 man bothy. And you can always make that 12-man bothy smaller and wrap it in tight, but you can't make a four-man bothy bigger. So investing into a large group orientated bit bothy. You call them bothies up north, yeah?
Yeah. And this is I think the thing that's really interesting was we did in November at Dunbar. This is actually photos from Barra, but you get the principle of it. Is it's highly visible, the group shelter. We did an exercise with the RNLI, and in the maze of skerries, trying to identify which one we were had our incident on, it was the group shelter that acted as the visual signal to come in. So really fascinating. Donor sports. Do you want to maybe do a quick thing on, you mentioned already swimming, coast steering, steering, just re-emphasize the values of donor sports for kayakers,
Yeah, when I was a level 3 coach in the old BCU system, I started working for Marine School, and they put me on a surf lifeguard course, and that surf lifeguard course was probably one of the most valuable courses that I did that benefited my kayaking. So I started thinking, well, how many other sports actually benefit me as a paddler? And coast steering was the big one. Coast steering gives you a lot of comfort when you're out of your boat and you've taken a swim in a rock garden, because that's what you're doing. That is the main aspect of the sport. And it also teaches you how to progress along a rocky shoreline in safety. And that's exactly what you might have to do when you're trying to manage an incident. You might have to get out of your boat, swim up onto the rocks, walk across the rocks. In fact, I can quote 3 different rescues that have saved lives by having to do exactly that, all club orientated rescues. So being comfortable in and around rocks, understanding how the surf zone works in greater detail, and if you have to swim into the surf to recover a casualty, all of these things. So a lot of the donor sports or cross training with other disciplines is really key to strengthening our capacity, putting more tools into the toolbox. And information is power. Having that extra knowledge so that you can actually feel a lot more comfortable in those environments is key. Once again, it's about establishing that comfort zone.
Fantastic. Well, just a few more slides, and then we'll move into Q&A. I see a few points in the chat. Just sorry, we are moving at pace. I suppose I'd encourage you to see this as a taster rather. It's not a course. It's an overview and a chance to kind of get some insight into the fresh thinking that Jeff has brought to rescues and incident management for sea kayaking. Playgrounds. So just to bring it back to, that video that we showed, and I don't, this is the same location here as the video part, and it's, I think, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the importance of kind of finding your own playground to develop this stuff and these kind of ideas of progressiveness?
Yeah, I think knowing your environment, knowing it on a given day. So exploring that environment when it's flat at low water, finding out what the subsurface hazards are potentially, swimming through those features, finding out what the areas of retention are, And then once you understand the environment, you understand what kind of scenarios you can start to develop within that environment. And I'm a really strong believer in repetitive training on the basics, creating really strong basics. Someone once said to me, you know, how do you define an advanced paddler? And I say, well, it's someone who's really strong at the basics in an advanced environment. The techniques don't change as we progress through the sports. It's just our exposure to more challenging environments. So having really um, strong basics, and then more environmental awareness. And what we want to do to kind of manage those neural pathways or be able to access those neural pathways, we want to create a lot of varied practice in our scenarios. So creating lots of different scenarios, not going so far out there that the scenarios, you know, we're not going to have aliens beaming down alongside of us trying to snatch us off into the ether, but actually creating just that varied practice so that we're having to train through that confusion. We're having to tame the mind, you know, and we do that through scenario-based training. Um, and then they become more complex. So initially, you might just be rescuing one unconscious casualty, but then, as with first aid, you might be dealing with a triage, and then you've got to actually ascertain who is the person that I need to really focus on first, and how can I manage this situation. When you think about an incident manager, there's normally only one person training incident management, and that's the leader. And then his number two's their assisting if they're not the casualty or victim. And then you've got your group members. Your group members are rarely, they're practicing their combat rescues and their towing. It's the incident manager that the pressure's on. And quite often when we do this training, um, if the pressure's not on you, if you're not the leader, quite often you see the answer before the leader does. And that's the area that you're training. You're training the mind to come up with this problem solving. So it's really important that we create these environments, and I mean the emotional environment where leaders can learn through making mistakes in a safe environment or a safer environment. And we can only do that if we really understand what our playground is. So you got to get to know the area. I'll seldom, if normally if I go and teach in a new area, so I'll be teaching up at the Orkney Symposium later on this summer, but I'm going up there the week before so that I can go and recce the area. I can get to know the environment. I can find out what features are going to lend a purpose to the outcomes that I need to achieve during that course. And if you don't know the area, you know, how do you know what the outcomes can be? You can take another guide with you. You can take local knowledge. So, you know, when I came up with you there, Russell, you had local knowledge here, and we went out and explored this environment, and we found it to be a really good working area. And I think that's key. What environment aspects lend itself to the lessons that you want to achieve on that given structure?
Fantastic. So, practice, how you structure practice. I'll share the BCAB links, but just for anyone who's not familiar with the Sea Kayak Safety and Rescue course, it's there's some really great stuff in there. So there's a course guide, and this is here from a little snippet from the first aid part, and you can see how you could use that to set up your own scenarios, and then you could choose your level of challenge that you wanted to do that. You might start with low environmental challenge, and then after a few iterations start to bring it up. And they have this useful kind of check box as well. When some of you may be familiar with the likes of this from Sea Kayak Leader, but if you have I would encourage everyone to have a look at these here as a way to structure practice for yourselves and in your clubs. And then, we'll just wrap it up, I think, with really the kind of the team part. I think for me, it's been a journey to find a team who share the same vision, who wants to support each other, and who has the same ideas about challenge. And quite often doing courses like the ones that Jeff provides is a way to find those similar souls, those common spirits, as it were. So anything you'd want to add, kind of in final, just about the importance of building that network, that team, that knowing the people, knowing the paddlers that you go on adventures with.
Yeah, that's the luxury of having been in a club environment, especially if all the club paddlers are passionate. You're going to be dealing with personalities that you know, so you'll have a term of reference to what's normal for John, so you'll recognize what's abnormal for John as well. So understanding your group and having that shared goal, that shared passion, because then it's easy to find a roadmap. It's when people want to go in different areas. Um, we mentioned at the front end of the of this program about prevention, and we haven't really mentioned much about prevention. I always say that with any of the incident management programs, you're there to train incident management, and you're not really exercising prevention at all. You're getting yourself into trouble, and quite often people will go away feeling um, much better equipped to deal with problems, but they then end up getting into problems. They'll start taking on challenges before they've really embedded the skills. So I think it's really key to understand if you've gone out on a multi-day trip and your kayak is really heavy and deep down in the water, it's not going to perform in the same way that it would when it's empty. So you wouldn't go rock hopping when you're on a 5-day trip necessarily. So does everyone understand that? Having that shared goal and that orientation at the front end of any experience is really key. With that group environment within a club, you also have the capacity to create these standard operating practices or normal operating procedures. So you can all start singing from the same hymn sheet. Everyone can understand what the role is of a casualty and how we approach a victim. So yeah, it's fantastic when you've got a very active, passionate club.
Superb. That that's, you never really know when you're going to need a team, but when you do need them, you very much do want to be able to ensure that you are working together as a team. And this is from the night exercise that we did in the last course with Jeff. We did 2 exercises with Dara and the Lie, and the night one, it was brilliant on two, lots of different ways. But one was it really showed that we, as a group, had been training together for people from all over the country, from Shetland, Orkney, from the Lake District, and from the east coast of Scotland. Training together, we gelled as a team to be able to work together in this exercise with Dara and Eli, and it was inspiring to see their commitment to working together as a team as well.
What you recognise with all
So
emergency services is that they do follow a trained process. They're not making it up when they're out there. They have an incident and they have a checklist and they proceed down that checklist. And that's what we need to do. If we want to, we don't have to. If you think of a professional paddler, quite often we say, well, a professional is someone who earns money from that activity. That's not professional, or that's not the only interpretation of professional. Having a professional approach to your paddling, you can still be an amateur paddler, you can still be a club-based paddler. You may not be earning any money from it. It may not be your living, but you can certainly have a professional approach to the way in which you conduct yourself on the water. And I think that's really key.
fantastic. And we'll open up to questions, but before we do, just you mentioned Orkney. You're going to be at the symposium, and are you delivering an incident management course after that? Is that
Yeah, so
correct?
we're going to be doing a week-long trip just before the symposium. We're going to be going up there and doing. We don't know exactly where we're going to go yet because that's obviously going to be weather dependent. But we're going to try and explore as much of the islands on over a 6-day period. That's going to give me also an opportunity to research some of the environments for the symposium, and then we'll be teaching at the symposium. And I don't know exactly what Sarah and Rambo have got in store for me on that, but we'll be running something there. And then I've got a 5-day incident management and leadership program running immediately after the symposium weekend.
Fantastic. And then we've got a tradition now of you coming and providing training in late autumn, October, November. So we're looking forward to welcoming you for that, and we can
It's a
share
great location.
details.
great location, and yeah, great people. Met some fantastic paddlers up there, and I really look forward to coming back up again. Yeah, brilliant.
Brilliant. So questions, we've got about, another 10 minutes or so. Who would like to ask Jeff something? And just come off mute, and shout out if you would like to. Oh, come on. Someone be brave.
Guys, although I've got a Sassenach voice and I come from the deep south, my family actually come from Shetland, so I have got a bit of blue and white in me as well. If that down any of the barriers.
Jeff,
Yeah.
Carolyn, yeah, Jeff, we
Hi,
we
Carolyn.
met. Hi there, we met in the autumn, didn't we?
Yeah, how you doing?
Yeah, fine, thanks. Just a leftover question that didn't get answered, and you haven't mentioned it. Configuration of your deck toe with
Yeah,
the quick releases. Could you
yeah.
maybe describe for us how that looks?
Contact toe.
Your
Yeah,
deck toe, your short deck toe with the
I have a short
safety.
deck toe. So I've got one of them somewhere in my. What I can do is I'll come back to that question because I'll find the picture for it.
Ah, right. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. I'll look now while I'm possibly answering another one, and then I can actually show you exactly how that works.
That would be fabulous. Thank you.
Great. Erica has asked about if you could talk us through some triage examples when there are multiple capsizes.
Yeah, there was a quite a well-known incident in Anglesey a few years ago where people have been playing in the races and they've decided to all pull out at the same time and head around the corner into Parliament House Cave. And just as they're approaching the cave on a relatively flat day, one of the ferries goes past and sends in a 4 or 5 foot wave and surfs the majority of the guys up onto the beach. But it's not a beach, it's just a big rock garden, especially with that kind of volume of water coming in. And what they found was the three instructors who were sitting out back suddenly were facing sort of 17, 18 people in the water, boats getting broken, boats getting washed up. So that's what I would say is a kind of triage where you've got multiple incidents going on, and you've got to identify what do you do first. Yeah. Same as if you walk into a room and there's two casualties lying on the floor. One might be very vocal, my arm, I've broken my arm, and they're screaming in pain. And the other one's very quietly just lying face down. You might get attracted to the very loud, noisy casualty, but it's actually the very quiet one lying there unobtrusively in the corner that's the actual person. So quite often we get drawn to the noise on a triage. And what we want to be looking for is that person that's still face down in the water, not making any noise at all. That would be the definition of a triage.
Fantastic. Great question from Neil Hamlet. Thanks, Neil. The top tips on how little people perform a hand of God rescue on big people.
So I always say with regards to a hand of God, rather than you'll need to focus on the technique over time, and that needs to obviously be worked upon. But what you've actually got here is a problem, and the problem is the airway is underwater, and it's getting that airway so that it's above the water. And I always say if you can't get them up, get them out. So it might be a case of popping their deck and then pulling them out of the kayak so that their airway comes above the surface, and then getting someone else in alongside who can do the hand of God. The objective is that you've got an unconscious casualty or a trapped paddler that's capsized and they're subsurface. What we've got to do is get them up so that they can breathe again. That's the problem. The roadmap to actually achieving that problem is, generally speaking, identified as being a hand of God. But if we only focus on the hand of God, then eventually we will all fail. because as boats get bigger and paddlers get heavier, eventually you're going to come, and we all get weaker over time. Eventually you're going to come to a situation where you can't get them out or you can't get them up. So have you trained the alternatives? So rather than being focused on just the technique, focus on the problem and finding another roadmap to find the solution. Yeah. Now, if we were here sitting in kayaks, I could show you ways of creating mechanical advantages, like creating space between the kayaks, because quite often what people are trying to do when they're doing the Hand of God is they're trying to lift a kayak up onto another kayak instead of rotating it. It's also about orientation. So what is your position in relationship to the other person? You know, so we can talk about the mechanics a lot easier when we're sitting alongside. But what I would say is don't look just at the technique, look at the problem. The problem is that we've got a blocked airway, and it's blocked because they're subsurface. And the priority is to get that airway above the surface. That is your ultimate priority. So I wouldn't spend too much time if I was trying to get the person up. I would be getting underneath, pulling their deck off and getting them out so that I could get them up into a position where their airway is above the surface of the water.
Fantastic.
Hi,
Any other
Jeff.
questions?
Can I ask a question?
Hi there, Rachel.
Please.
How are you doing?
Yeah, your Nordcap's down in London now with Harry Whelan.
All right, okay. I hope he's looking after it. I miss it.
You remember you sold me the Nordcap?
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah. I miss it.
Yeah, I bet.
Anyhow, rescue. We you talk about going into play areas, and we all like to explore caves. When you're inside a cave, and then something, waves start coming in, all of a sudden it might have been a ferry going past or something like that. What's your way of managing that?
So what we tend to do with caves is, first of all, have you been there before? So we've certainly got caves in the southwest that have got sandy bottoms, and they can be quite shallow. So you'll actually have surf going into the cave.
Yep.
So that might be the feature. If it's a really deep cave, then that might get extended out of your reach beyond. So what is the nature of the feature? I always say that only put so many people into a situation at a time. So control that. If you put 5 people into a cave at once and a big section, you've got to get 5 people out. So only expose one person to danger at a time. And I always put either myself or my number 2 at the back of a cave, because what I want to do is prevent people going beyond that point where I'm happy to recover them. So I'll brief my number 2 and I'll say, okay, can you go and sit at the back of a cave? I would have recce'd it first and made sure that it was suitable and that it was within their capacity. I'll put them at the back and I'll just say, don't let anyone go beyond you. And then I'll only expose one person. And generally speaking, I will say to people to go in backwards so that they've got an eye on the environment. They can see what influences are coming into the cave, big swells, whatever. But they can also generate power to get out of a cave quickly if they have to.
Yeah, it's always difficult when it's a really black cave and you can't see anything, and your head torch is hardly touching the blackness.
Or doing it at night. We had a scenario once on a guide program where someone got surfed sideways into a cave at night and came out of their boat. It was very vocal. They worked on the scenario that their foot got stuck between the rocks, so they were going subsurface, and then they were vocal, and then they were going subsurface. And then they did start actually making a lot of loud noises when they found they were sharing the cave with a very large bull seal. So sometimes you never know what Neptune's going to throw up in.
Well, you often get seals in the back of a cave.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a good one. I mean, there's a great cave up there on the Point of Stour where you go in one side and then out the other side. So I managed that. So it was quite, an interesting swell coming in. So I had one person going in at a time and one person checking and the other one allowing the next one through. So I was watching them through like that. So again, as you say, control that entry and exit. So you've only got one person in there at one time, and keep the rest of the group safe in a safe area.
And that investment into understanding what people should do, so that actions on capsize, turn your boat over, clip in, swim out.
Yeah.
So if someone's calling into you, can you swim out? If the
Yeah.
answer is yes, you should already be swimming out. And we need to practice those things as well. Getting
Yeah.
clear of danger really quickly, putting space between you and that feature is key. You don't want to be hanging around in a dynamic environment when there's rocks and glass fiber in close proximity.
Yeah, no. I mean, I did get. I mean, there was a big Russian guy. He capsized. He turned around to look. He'd come through the cave, and he was. I said, "Wait there in that safe area there." But he was facing the wrong way. He should have turned. I should have get him to turn around so he could see his wife coming through. And there was only the three of us, and his wife came through, and she clattered her paddles off the rocks. And so he turned around and he capsized. So I had him in the cave, and the other one I said to send her out straight away. I said, "You guys get straight out." And then got him, towed him away from the rocks to the edges and got him back in his boat. But then he went capsized again. So then I just did a contact tour and just towed them both out into the open water and then got them back in. So it was an interesting one.
Yeah. Knowing your group is key, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I was really worried about the size of that guy because I'm not a big person anymore. And I did do some practices with him, so I was very confident I could get him into that boat again. But then it's about different boats as well, knowing the boats as well. So, there was a guy who had a Wilderness Systems. It was a really wide, beamy boat that's not easy to empty. So I got him. I didn't push the group out on a big trip just the other week. It was big season. I thought, well, if he does capsize, I'm going to have a right job on getting him back in his boat in that pig of a boat. So it's
good. So it's great to see the level of engagement, and thanks, brilliant to have people's experience shared. So brilliant, Rachel. Thank you for that. We are at 8:30 now, so I don't want to keep Jeff too much longer. We can maybe take one more question. And then if people have further questions, then feel free to send them to me afterwards, and I can pull them together and ask Jeff and then distribute that with the reading list if you like. But does anyone else have one more question would want to ask?
I'm just sharing these photographs.
Great.
So I'll send them to you by WhatsApp there, Russell, and then you can maybe put them up there if you wish.
Great.
Okay. Can I ask Jeff a question about your throw tow and throwing technique, if possible?
Yeah.
So I'm a river paddler, so I'm used to using a throw bag in various situations. So I've got one of Jeff's throw tows that I use quite often for doing rescues for gullies and other bits and pieces, and I find it really effective. But I haven't come up with a technique yet where I can throw it the full 15 meters. So I've had to cut it down to 10 because even with using elastics or a side throw, I still can't get it to go any further than 10 meters. So, at my very max, is there a trick for getting it to go any further than that?
So the first photo that was made, it was 18 meters. And the only person I ever saw that could throw that to full capacity was Joe Leach. And I certainly couldn't throw it to its full length, certainly not from the seat of a kayak. I've reduced mine down to 12 meters and I can now throw it there, 12 meters. So, but that's still an advantage. That's still a 12-meter reach beyond your kayak that you wouldn't have without it. I've also seen Tom Thorpe. He created a knapsack to put onto the bag, and he threw it in the same way that the Inuit would hurl a harpoon. So there are other ways that you can extend your capacity for throwing that further. So a knapsack would be an option, and you would slide that into the bag and then project it in that fashion. But I think you're right in reducing the length of it. Have you got the HF version?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Yeah. what I've done with the HF one is taken that stationary clip off the bottom so that if I need to, I can take that clip off and I've got a clean line to send through, so that you're not projecting in a hook as well if you need to. If you're going to take it onto a river, I think you'd want to have a clean line. In terms of using the photo, we sort of say, it's a lesson in itself. When we project it in, if it's got the hook on the end, then that denotes that it's a boat extraction, and you'd expect them to clip that hook into the boat, the deck lines. The paddler would go to the safe area, and then you would extract them and the boat. If it comes in without a hook, it's normally a person extraction, and they would receive it in the same way that you would on a river, take it under your arm, away from your neck, and get pulled backwards through the water. If you're around the Dunbar area in November or up on Orkney in the summer, I can go through all the different uses with you with it, and we can have a look at that.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thanks. Yeah, we're booked on to Orkney again this year, and then going back up to Shetland after the symposium. But yeah, definitely be interested in hooking up maybe October, November when your next course is, because we paddle a bit with Hamish
Oh yeah,
on Shetland as well, and he said that it was a brilliant course. So
brilliant.
yeah,
Look
interested
forward to
in
seeing you,
that.
Peter. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, magic. Cheers. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This is the photos here. I don't know if I've quite got them all, Jeff, but can you see that?
I'm not quite sure what ones I shared with you. I just saw them as a batch, so I sent them all along.
Yeah.
So this basically works on a bridle that runs across the foredeck. So I've taken my deck lines off and I've replaced them with Kevlar or Dyneema lines, and they go in a perpetual triangle around the kayak. So if any of the deck fittings pull out, I'm not going to lose contact. And then the bridle across the foredeck, I have a strop that can run to either the left side or the right side, and that's on a quick release snap shackle. And then I have an extending strap, which has a cinch buckle on it, so I can shorten it down, and a quick release a stainless steel snap clip for attaching to the kayak that I'm going to be contact towing. But we can also use this as a paddle park, and we can also use it as a rescue stirrup for bringing the person back up into the cockpit if need be.
Is that a Kraken carabiner, Jeff?
No, no. I think Steve's changed slightly the Krakens. We were using them for a while, but they were any kind of sideways pressure, they were starting to open up on us. So
Right.
that's a stainless steel sailing orientated shackle. It's a little bit heavy actually. I'd probably now change it and use one of the DMM clips that I've put onto the new photos.
Okay, great. Unless anyone's got any final, must-ask questions.
Jeff, you said you changed your deck line for a different deck line.
Yeah, so I
would
use
the ordinary deck line not suit that system just across the top?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I needed to make it longer anyway, because normally it ends on the recessed deck fittings nearest the cockpit.
Yeah.
You have your elastic that comes over, so I needed a longer one, and I thought I'd use something that's going to just be longer lasting. And I had a load of Dyneema line from my sailing boat that I live on, so I just utilised Dyneema.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because that needs to be a fixed line going across, because usually it's elastic, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's rope going across there.
Yeah.
And Jeff, while you're there was one word you used that has foxed me. You said Narsak or something like that, was it? Or
Narsak, that's the short leather, the short wooden hollowed out section of wood that they use for projecting a harpoon.
Ah,
right. Okay, for spearing walruses and such things as we might also want to do. That's fine.
Well, people used to say you can't throw a throw bag from a kayak, and I said, well, how did the Inuit throw their harpoons in? you know, they were pretty accurate and they were throwing them pretty far. So, and also water polo players, they project balls from the kayak. So how is it that we can't project a rope from a kayak? You know? And also when you look at some of the features that people are rock hopping into, you know, if you take a swim in there, can you realistically get 2 kayaks into that same feature? You know, so being able to throw a line in and clip in and pull them out again, I think saves damage in your boat, saves damage in your body, and creates that safe distance to operate in.
Right.
Fantastic.
How do you spell it? That's the next question.
Great. We'll put the spelling in the reading notes.
Thanks, Russell.
Yeah, no problem. So Jeff, thank you so much. Thanks for your giving so generously of your time this evening. If people want to engage with you, you've described, you're going to be in in Orkney in the summer, and then you'll be doing stuff with ourselves in October, November. But if anyone wants to reach out to you directly, are you happy? Happy
Yeah,
for that?
absolutely. Yeah, you can share my WhatsApp and email address, and find us on normal social media channels under Expedition Paddler. So either Instagram or Facebook, personal message me. That's absolutely fine as well.
Great. So we'll share your details as well.
Yeah. Love your job.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff.